Welcome to the chapel of Merton College, Oxford, where we're going to be talking about how to practice effectively. Good practice methods are the key to success. And it's not just enough to put in the time practicing, how you practice is just as important, if not more important. You can accomplish far more in a short period of practice using good practice techniques than you can in a longer period using inefficient ones. Moreover, bad practice techniques can actually be counterproductive. They can cause you to learn mistakes into your music, for example, or to practice with harmful physical tension. This film will provide a general overview of how to practice effectively, and it's very much about showing a process rather than an end result. In it, Stephen Farr, who teaches many of the organ scholars at both Oxford and Cambridge, is going to learn a piece in front of you. He's going to be looking at a short chorale prelude by Max Reger, talking you through his mental process and showing you some techniques that you can use in your own practice. This is a genuine practice session. Apart from choosing the piece in advance, Stephen has not yet practiced it at all. If you want to follow along with the score, it's available on the Oundle for Organists website and the Royal College of Organists website.
Of all the things to talk about with organ playing, practice is one of the trickiest. It's not always a linear process from day to day, even for professional performers. And I'm walking the plank a little bit today because I'm just going to work on a piece I've never seen before. Practice can be affected sometimes quite inexplicably by your general sense of well-being and energy levels, just like performance, in fact. And one of the tricky things about practice is that it's an essential part of the learning process, but usually it's one that relies entirely on your own ability to analyze and self-criticize without external guidance. Apart from getting on the internet and choosing a piece to work on, I genuinely haven't looked at all at the score I'm going to be working on in this film. And much of what I'm going to say is going to be personal insight, if you like, things that I've found have worked for me. But do bear in mind that teachers and other performers can have many valuable and different perspectives on the whole business of practice, and keep an open mind about drawing on other people's insights and experiences in this area. So to work on today, I've chosen a piece by Max Reger. It's a chorale prelude from his Opus 67 collection, and it's based on the well-known chorale tune Ein feste Burg. In a moment, I'll start to work on the score, but first I just thought I would offer a few general kind of observations. The first thing I find really helpful with practice is to try and make sure that I have an ordered environment in which to do it. If you generally do your own practice on an instrument of which you don't have sole possession, that can be a hard thing to manage. But one thing that I think is fundamental is that you don't have your phone or your tablet pinging away on the music desk, inviting you to update your status. And especially if you're working around demands that other people might be making on your instrument or the building in which it sits, it's really important that you try to arrive at a practice session with a clear goal of what you might want to achieve within it. That goal doesn't have to be immense. It can be something as small, for example, as organising the fingering in a particular bar. But it is important that you have a really clearly defined objective for what you're trying to achieve each time. No work is wasted, ever, if you're methodical about your practice habits. Do remember to take short breaks. I find that after about an hour, I experience diminishing returns in a practice session. So don't push yourself past the boundary where you're starting to tire and maybe find it hard to concentrate as well as you were. Now we arrive at the moment of truth, and here's the score on the music desk next to me. In the interests of authenticity, I haven't looked at the score at all, as I've previously mentioned. But what I would recommend is that you consider how much useful work you can do away from the organ, or even away from a keyboard, in terms of perusal and just general mental familiarity with the piece. The question of whether to play through a piece in its entirety at the beginning of the practice process is an interesting one, and people have different views on this. On the one hand, it can be quite useful as a sight reading practice, and it can give you a sense of the overall shape of the piece that you're working towards as you gain familiarity with the work. On the other hand, it can, at a very early stage, set you up for bad habits in fingering and pedalling and rhythm, which it can be surprisingly hard to eradicate as you continue the practice process. My own general approach is to reserve playing through sections of music until the end of a practice session as a way of checking the progress that I've made and that the things that I've tried to resolve in each session have been really well embedded into my technique. I'm going to work on the last page of the piece, first of all. It's psychologically quite useful to have the feeling that you're constantly working into music with which you're already familiar, rather than constantly striking out into new territory. But do remember to join your sections up. It's very easy to work on an 8-bar passage in isolation and on another 8-bar passage in isolation, but to forget how important it is to join the last bar of one section to the first bar of the next. And I've heard several performances where people have clearly forgotten that crucial aspect of their preparation until they've actually arrived at the moment of performance. Maybe just a quick word at this point about registration. It's great fun to hack through a big piece of 19th century music on a grand tutti, but it's not always the most helpful way to enable you to hear and analyse detail and texture. So what I'm going to do is select quite a small, clear registration. So on this, the Dobson organ of Merton College, Oxford, I'm just going to use 2 clear and quite soft flutes on the choir, the 8 and forfeit. And don't be ashamed to have a metronome. Metronomes get a bit of a bad press in some quarters these days, but in the business of practice and preparation, they're a really invaluable tool, not least because when you keep returning to a passage, it's surprisingly easy to play it a little bit faster each time. And if you set yourself a metronome speed for a practice session, you can check that you're constantly returning to your basic tempo. I'm now going to turn to the score. I'm working, as I said, on the last page. I'm not going to attempt a playthrough. I'm going to identify, first of all, particular issues that I think I want to pay close attention to at the start of the process. So first of all, I'm going to look at the pedal part, which in some ways could hardly be simpler, but I think there are 1 or 2 things I just want to be absolutely sure of. There's a ben marcato marking over the pedal part, so already at this early stage I'm trying to ensure that I'm selecting a pedalling that enables me to show that marking very, very clearly. And in the last 3 bars of the piece, I just have to make some decisions about how to distribute toe and heel pedalling. There are 2 pieces of information I want to make sure I record. The first is a change between feet on one particular note, and I'll mark that in the score. And then the organisation of toe and heel and distribution between left and right feet in the short scale in the penultimate bar. And I'm going to check that pedalling 1 more time to make sure that I'm happy with it. So now I'm going to move up the texture to the left hand. And there are 2 issues that I've identified. The first is there's some internal phrasing and articulation that I want to be sure that I embed at an early stage. And the second is that there are some slightly unconventional and not entirely ergonomic figurations that need careful attention when it comes to fingering. There are two things I want to have very much at the forefront of my mind at this stage. The first is that I want to avoid adopting fingerings that can work at a slow tempo but will never be feasible at a fast tempo. And in particular, it's very easy to resort to lots of extraneous finger substitution when you're playing slowly, which is very, very unhelpful when you arrive at your eventual performance tempo. The second thing is that I want to make sure that any markings I'm putting in are really clear and consistent and legible. And on the screen in a moment, you will see a page from the score that I prepared earlier, not the page I'm working on. I didn't cheat, but it will give you a little flavour of perhaps how not to mark a score in the interests of clarity and legibility. I'm going to stop at this moment because there are two things I just want to organise. The first is where my thumb is going in the first bar with this descending figuration, and the second is just to make sure that I also know where my thumb is going in the chromatic passage in the second system. And now I'm going to turn to the second line of music, the second bar, and just sort out the chromatics in the left hand. And at this point in the process, there's a little bit of trial and error. There are several viable solutions, and I need to find the one that I think is going to be the most consistent and reliable of the options available. And I'm going to continue the same process, but moving closer towards the end of the piece, where the left-hand motion becomes more continuous with semiquaver patterns. So I've decided after a few repetitions that I've found what feels to me to be the most comfortable position for my hand and for when my thumb turns over and under. So I'm going to mark that in the score now. I'm going to spend a moment experimenting with a few possible options for a slightly awkward corner in the second bar now. That one doesn't feel so comfortable, and I think it's not going to be reliable, so I'm going to try another possibility. That already feels much better, and I think I can commit to that, so I'm going to make a marking. You may notice that I'm doing two things, or I'm trying to do two things. The first is that when I arrive at a moment that needs resolution, I'm always trying to work back 2 or 3 beats. I'm not just homing in on the moment of difficulty, because it's often in the approach to a passage which causes some challenges that the technical difficulty can arise. So always work back a little bit further in the music than the place which you're trying to resolve. And then the second thing is that I'm very assiduously avoiding doing this. Where you put your finger firmly on fast forward for what feel like the easy bits, and then you slow down for the tricky bits. It's absolutely fatal for rhythmic stability to do that. So work always to a really consistent, steady tempo. Don't be tempted to speed up when the challenges are fewer. So moving onwards up through the score, I'm now going to look at the right hand. And there are 2 things that I know I'm going to have to think about quite carefully here. The first is the business of managing the right hand notes themselves. And the second is how to manage what you might call the choreography of dividing the parts between the hands. It's not always the best solution to adopt the printing layout where everything in the upper stave is played by the right hand, everything in the lower stave by the left. So let's see how this goes. So I already know 2 things. The first is that I'm going to have to ask my left hand to help the right in 1 or 2 places. And the second is that I'm going to need to work out quite carefully some finger substitutions in the interests of maintaining a good cantabile. And once again, I'm going to explore a few different possibilities here. I'm already aware that there's a problem that I need to resolve, but what I know is also not going to be very effective is just to keep repeating the passage again and again with a small error without trying to analyze quite carefully what's causing the difficulties. So there's going to be a little bit of trial and error at this point. Now, the difficulty I've isolated is the business of managing the legato here in a slightly awkward texture, and also how to maintain a consistent legato. And what's emerging in that little process I've just undertaken is the possibility that using the left hand to take some of the notes from the right is actually going to solve that problem. So I'm just going to play around a little bit with some possibilities. So I think I'm arriving at the germ of a solution here. So I feel like I've resolved a difficulty in the first bar here, but I just want to make sure that my solution is consonant with things that I might need to do in the few beats before it. So I'm just going to go back a little bit further into the music to make sure that this still seems like a good idea. That seems to have come out in the wash quite well. So I'm going to move on a little bit further into the score. And I just feel the need for a little cautionary accidental in two places. It's actually surprisingly tricky, and I'm going to look at the possibility of sharing the parts between the left and the right. I think that gives me a better solution. So I'm going to move on now to the last bar here, and I think there's going to be an issue with managing legato here. So again, it's going to be a process of trial and error to see if I can arrive at a good solution. Now that doesn't feel like it's going to work well at my eventual performance tempo. So I'm going to go straight in on the moment that could be awkward. The difficulty here is trying to maintain legato at this moment. I may need to use a slightly unconventional fingering, and I'm going to try that. I'm a little bit nervous about whether that will work at a faster tempo, so I'm just going to explore some other options. So in the end, the best solution seems to be to use the left hand for a substantial amount of the right hand music. But I'm going too fast too soon. So I'm going to go really slowly, and I'm going to stop at the juncture where I need to think especially hard about the division between the hands, and make sure that I have the chance to assimilate that really thoroughly into my muscle memory. And once more. Well, I'm just going to carry on from the point at which I've arrived, still very slowly. This is a passage which is going to need a little bit of longer term attention, I think. But I'm just going to spend a moment introducing some practice techniques that I think I'm going to want to use in the longer term in resolving the challenges of this passage. I'm going to play the music using a variety of rhythmic modifications, dotted rhythms and grouping 4 notes into different kind of configurations rhythmically. So the idea is that I'm trying to concentrate my attention on quite small rhythmic units. And changing the rhythms in this way will kind of, as it were, shine a spotlight on particular short values. So the first thing I'm going to do is play in dotted rhythm, still very slowly. Already there's a little error. In real life, as it were, I would continue that process for a little bit longer. But I'm now going to move to the different kind of rhythmic modification, which is to play short, long rhythms in groups of 4, just like this. Another technique is to play 3 notes together and then linger on the 4th like this. As I say, the permutations are pretty much limitless, but that kind of practice can be really useful for resolving little knotty issues in short note values. And I'm going to try the passage one last time, slowly, but back into equal rhythm. And already, semi-quaver to semi-quaver, I feel that I have a more structured grasp on what my fingers need to be doing at each given moment. I'm now towards the end of this short practice session, and so I'm just going to play 8 bars or so of the piece, taking into account the things that I've worked on. And it's just a little bit of a progress check and will give me a sense of what I need to continue to work on when the cameras aren't here. So we've reached the end of this short film about practice. I hope that it's introduced you to some useful and helpful techniques. There's a wonderful quotation from Albert Einstein to the effect that the definition of madness is doing the same thing the same way 1,000 times in a row and expecting a different result at the end of it. And it's quite a nice maxim to apply to practice. It could encourage you to be efficient, to be analytical, to vary your approach to different passages. And I wish you the very, very best of luck with your preparations.